She jumped off the Silvermere Bridge at midnight, her wedding dress billowing like a ghost in the wind. The icy river waited below, promising silence after years of screaming. But she never hit the water. Strong arms caught her midair, and a voice like winter storms whispered against her hair. "You're safe now. I promise you, you're safe." The Vampire King held her as if she were made of spun glass and dying wishes. Ilara had climbed over the stone railing with numb fingers, her bare feet balancing on the edge, where centuries of desperate souls had stood before her. The bridge stretched across the Shadowfen Gorge, connecting the human territories to the vampire lands beyond. Most people crossed it in carriages, clutching holy symbols and prayers. She'd walked it alone in a wedding gown she never chose, heading nowhere, ready to fall. She hadn't heard him approach. Vampires moved like silk through shadows, and King Casimir was older than the bridge itself, older than the stones of his castle that pierced the sky beyond the gorge. One moment she was stepping into empty air. The next, his arms were around her waist, pulling her back against a chest that hadn't drawn breath in 300 years. They stood frozen on the railing together, her toes dangling over nothing, his boots planted firm on stone, worn smooth by rain and regret. The wind pulled at her dress, at her hair that had taken her sisters 3 hours to braid with flowers she didn't want. Below, the Silvermere River rushed over rocks, sharp enough to shred skin from bone. She'd been counting on that. "Let me go," Ilara whispered. Her voice cracked like ice in spring. She hadn't spoken above a whisper in 6 months, not since her father announced her engagement to Lord Brennan, not since her mother started planning a wedding to a man who smiled with his mouth, but never his eyes. "No." The Vampire King's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of centuries. His arms tightened fractionally, careful, as if he understood exactly how breakable she was. "I've stood on this bridge for 200 years, watching, and I've never stopped someone from jumping. But tonight, I will." Ilara's laugh tasted like copper and salt. "Why tonight? What makes me different from all the others you let fall?" "Because you're wearing a wedding dress." His breath, cool as autumn frost, stirred her hair. "And you're not running toward death. You're running away from something worse." The words broke something in her chest, something that had been cracking for months. Her knees buckled. The Vampire King lifted her from the railing as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against armor that should have been cold, but somehow wasn't. She should have been terrified. Everyone knew what vampires were, what they did, what they took. But terror required energy, and Ilara had none left. "My family," she managed, the words scraping her throat raw. "They'll come looking for me. They'll find me. They'll drag me back, and I can't. I can't breathe." His hand, gloved in black leather, settled against her spine. "Your family doesn't know where you are. This bridge marks the border. The moment I carried you 3 steps north, you entered my territory, and I don't negotiate with humans who chase their daughters to death." Ilara's vision blurred. She couldn't tell if it was tears or shock, or the strange golden glow emanating from the castle that rose in the distance, all spires and impossible angles, beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. She'd never seen anything so magnificent in her life. Her father's manor was all right angles and duty, brown and beige and boring, filled with people who moved like chess pieces across polished floors. "I don't understand," she said. "Why would you help me? I'm nobody. I'm nothing." The Vampire King started walking, his stride smooth and unhurried, carrying her as if this were perfectly normal, as if he regularly collected suicidal women from bridges at midnight. "I'm taking you to the castle. You'll have a room, food, safety. In the morning, when you've slept and eaten, we'll discuss what comes next. But tonight, You're under my protection, and that means no one, living or dead, will harm you. I don't have anywhere to go after." The confession fell out of her like stones from her pockets. "Even if I wanted to leave, I have nothing. No money, no skills, no references. I was raised to be ornamental, to smile and nod and produce heirs for a man I've met twice. Then you'll stay." His tone suggested this was obvious, simple, already decided. "My castle has 500 rooms. You can have your pick. Stay a week, a year, forever. It's your choice, lady." He paused. "I don't know your name." "Elara." It felt strange to say her own name, after months of being called the bride, or Lord Brennan's betrothed, or that Thornwood girl. Just Elara, simple and plain, belonging only to herself. Elara. The way he said it made it sound like music, like something precious. "I'm Casimir. Though most call me Your Majesty, you may call me whatever feels comfortable." They passed through an iron gate that swung open at their approach, moved by invisible hands, or perhaps magic. Elara had stopped trying to understand vampire castle mechanics. The courtyard beyond bloomed with night flowers, white petals glowing faintly in the darkness, releasing perfume that smelled like hope and new beginnings. Ridiculous, she thought. Flowers can't smell like emotions. But these did. Servants materialized from doorways, vampire and human both, their faces carefully neutral, as their king carried a bedraggled woman in a ruined wedding dress through the entrance hall. No one asked questions. No one stared. They simply bowed and continued their tasks as if this happened every Tuesday. Casimir carried her up a grand staircase that spiraled like a nautilus shell, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and tapestries depicting battles she didn't recognize. They walked down a corridor where crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on marble floors, past doors carved with symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. He stopped at a door painted midnight blue, studded with silver stars. "This was my daughter's room," he said quietly. "Before. It's been empty for 70 years. I think she'd want someone to use it, someone who needs sanctuary." The room beyond was beautiful in a way that made Elara's chest ache. A 4-poster bed with curtains like starlight, windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, overlooking gardens that shouldn't exist in November, but did, lush and green and impossible. Bookshelves crammed with volumes in languages she recognized, and many she didn't. A fireplace where flames danced without wood or coal, burning on magic alone. Casimir set her down carefully on the bed, which was softer than clouds, softer than anything she'd ever felt. He stepped back, giving her space, as if he understood that after months of her family crowding her, controlling her, deciding her every movement, space was what she needed most. "There's a bathing room through that door," he said, gesturing. "The water runs hot without pumping. There are clothes in the wardrobe, my daughter's things. You're similar in size, I think. Wear whatever you like. Burn that dress if it pleases you." Elara looked down at the wedding dress, at the seed pearls her mother had sewn by hand, at the lace her grandmother had made 70 years ago for her own wedding, to a man who hit her for burning dinner. The dress was a family heirloom, a symbol of tradition, of duty, of women swallowing their screams. "I'd like to burn it," she whispered. "Is that terrible? I think it's honest." Casimir moved to the fireplace, held out his hand. "May I?" She stood on shaking legs, let him help her out of the heavy gown, standing in just her slip while he carried the dress to the flames. They both watched it catch and burn, silk turning to ash, pearls popping in the heat, like tiny screams finally released. The smoke smelled like freedom. "Tomorrow," Casimir said, his back still turned to give her privacy. "You'll meet my household. They'll help you settle in, answer questions, show you around. Tonight, just rest. Lock the door if it makes you feel safer. No one will disturb you." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Alara? What you did tonight, standing on that bridge, it took courage. Surviving what drove you there will take more. I believe you have it." Then he was gone, the door clicking softly behind him, and Alara was alone for the first time in 6 months. Truly alone, with a lock she controlled and a room no one could enter without permission. She wanted to cry. She wanted to sleep. She wanted to understand why a vampire king had saved her when her own family would have watched her fall. Instead, she bathed. The water ran hot just as he'd promised, filling a marble tub large enough to swim in. She scrubbed until her skin turned pink, washing away the touch of her sisters braiding her hair, her mother lacing her corset, her father's hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the carriage that would take her to the church. She washed until she felt almost human again, almost herself, almost clean. The wardrobe held treasures. Dresses in colors her mother would have called inappropriate. Deep purples and forest greens and midnight blues. Trousers like men wore, practical and freeing. Soft nightgowns that didn't itch or bind. She chose the simplest nightgown, white cotton that felt like wearing air, and climbed into the bed. She should have been afraid. She was in a vampire castle, alone, vulnerable, wearing a dead girl's clothes. But the bed was soft, and the room was warm, and for the first time since she could remember, no one was going to wake her at dawn to begin wedding preparations. No one was going to criticize her posture or her appetite, or the way she laughed too loud for a proper lady. Alara cried then, finally, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for the girl who'd stood on the bridge, for the childhood she'd never had, for the future she'd almost died to escape. She cried until exhaustion pulled her under like a tide, dragging her into sleep so deep even nightmares couldn't reach her. She woke to sunlight, which seemed impossible. Vampires and sunlight didn't mix, everyone knew that. Yet golden light streamed through the windows, warming her face, painting everything amber and honey. Alara sat up, confused, and noticed the windows weren't really windows at all. They were spelled somehow, showing an illusion of outdoors, while the real glass, layered behind magic, was dark and protective. A knock at the door made her freeze. "Lady Alara?" A woman's voice, human by the warmth in it. "I'm Mira, the head housekeeper. His Majesty sent me to see if you needed anything." Alara wrapped herself in a dressing gown she found draped over a chair and opened the door. The woman standing there was perhaps 50, with kind eyes and flour on her apron. She smiled like grandmothers did, warm and uncomplicated. "Good morning, dear. I've brought breakfast. His Majesty thought you might not want to face the dining hall just yet." She wheeled in a cart laden with food, more food than Alara had been allowed to eat in months. Fresh bread, jam, butter, eggs cooked 3 different ways, fruit, cheese, pastries that smelled like cinnamon and dreams. "I don't understand." Alara's voice came out small. "Why is everyone being so kind?" Mira's expression softened. "King Casimir doesn't bring people here lightly. In 200 years, you're the 3rd person he's carried across that bridge. The first was his wife, fleeing an arranged marriage to a cruel duke. The second was his daughter, running from witch hunters. He understands what it means to need sanctuary." "What happened to them? His wife and daughter?" Mira's smile dimmed. "His wife lived happily here for 50 years before illness took her. Vampires can't turn humans against their will, you see. And she chose to remain human, to age naturally. The daughter grew up safe and loved. She fell in love with a human boy from the village, married him, moved away. She lived a full life, wrote letters every week until she passed of old age, surrounded by grandchildren. But he said the room had been empty for 70 years. Grief takes time, especially for beings who measure time in centuries. He kept it exactly as she left it, like a shrine, until last night. Until you. Mira patted her hand. Eat, dear. Your skin and bones. When you're ready, I'll show you around. The food tasted like colors, like sunshine and laughter, and everything her mother's dining table wasn't. Ilara ate until she felt human again, solid, real, present in her own body. Then she dressed in the practical clothes she'd found, dark trousers and a green tunic that made her feel like she could run if she needed to, like she could fight. Mira led her through the castle, pointing out rooms and introducing servants who smiled at her like she belonged. The library held 50,000 books. The gardens grew vegetables that shouldn't survive this far north. The music room contained instruments from every culture imaginable. The castle was a contradiction, dark and light, deadly and safe, vampire and human existing in careful balance. We have about 40 humans living here permanently, Mira explained, as they walked through the kitchen garden. Some are servants, but many are just residents, artists, scholars, people escaping bad situations. His Majesty offers protection in exchange for company, conversation, helping the castle function. But no one is forced to stay, and everyone is paid fair wages. They found King Casimir in the library, surrounded by books stacked higher than his head, making notes in margins with handwriting too small and precise to be anything but ancient. He looked different in daylight, or the castle's approximation of it. Less fearsome, more tired. He'd removed the armor, wore simple black clothing that made him look almost human, except for the supernatural stillness, the way he didn't breathe unless speaking. Ilara. He stood when he saw her, that old-fashioned courtesy that marked him as from another era. You look rested. How are you feeling? Confused, she admitted. Grateful. Terrified my family will come. All of it at once. Your family won't come. His certainty was absolute. I sent a message to your father this morning. I told him you'd sought sanctuary in my territory, that you were under my personal protection, and that any attempt to retrieve you would be considered an act of war. I also mentioned that Lord Brennan might want to look elsewhere for a bride, as you'd chosen a different future. Ilara's knees went weak. You declared war on my father? I declared war as a possibility if he's stupid enough to test me. Most humans aren't. Casimir gestured to a chair. Sit. Please. You look like you're going to faint, and I'd rather not catch you again so soon. She sat, her mind racing. My father will be furious. The scandal. Our family's reputation. Your family's reputation isn't your responsibility. He said it so simply, as if this truth were obvious. You didn't choose your father's cruelty, or your mother's complicity, or the society that treats daughters like currency. You chose to survive. That's all that matters. Why? The question burst from her like a confession. Why save me? Why offer me sanctuary? You don't know me. I could be terrible. I could be dangerous. Casimir smiled, and it transformed his face from marble to something almost warm. You jumped off a bridge rather than marry a man you didn't love. That tells me everything I need to know about your courage and your character. As for why? He paused, choosing words carefully. I've lived 300 years, Ilara. I've seen empires rise and fall, watched humans repeat the same cruelties generation after generation. But occasionally, very occasionally, I see someone worth saving. Someone who might, given the chance, make the world slightly better. You're one of those people. You can't possibly know that from one night. I've been alive long enough to recognize light when I see it, even when it's almost extinguished." He returned to his books, giving her space to process. "You don't have to decide your future today. Stay as long as you need. If you want to leave eventually, I'll help you establish yourself elsewhere. If you want to stay, you're welcome permanently. But for now, just breathe. Just exist. Just remember what it feels like to be yourself." Over the following days, Ilara learned what sanctuary meant. It meant waking without dread, eating without criticism, walking through rooms without someone monitoring her every movement. It meant conversations, where people asked her opinions and actually listened to her answers. It meant discovering she liked books about astronomy and music that made her want to dance, and gardens where she could dig in dirt until her hands were filthy. She met the castle's other residents: Thomas, a scholar escaping religious persecution, who spent his days translating ancient texts; Isabel, an artist whose paintings had been deemed too provocative by her hometown's church, who now filled the castle with colors that sang; Marcus, a former soldier with scars on his body and shadows in his eyes, who'd found peace tending the stables. Each had their own story of escape, survival, sanctuary. The vampire residents were fewer but just as varied. Lady Seraphine, Casimir's sister, who dressed in gowns from the previous century and spoke 6 languages; Lord Dimitri, the castle's weapons master, who'd been turned during some medieval war and still spoke with an accent that predated modern nations; others, whose names Ilara learned slowly, carefully, trying to understand the hierarchy and culture of a society utterly different from her own. But it was Casimir she found herself drawn to, perhaps because he'd been the first voice in her darkest moment, or perhaps because he seemed to understand silence as well as she did. They fell into a routine, evenings in the library, sitting in companionable quiet while she read, and he worked on whatever mysterious projects occupied a king's time. He never pushed her to talk, never demanded her story, simply existed nearby like a steady presence. 2 weeks after her arrival, Ilara finally asked the question that had been burning in her chest. They were in the library, firelight dancing across book spines, comfortable silence stretching between them like a cat in sunshine. "Mira said your wife fled an arranged marriage, that your daughter ran from witch hunters. Is that why you helped me? Because I reminded you of them?" Casimir looked up from his book, his dark eyes reflecting centuries of memory. "Partially. My wife, Lenora, came to this bridge 300 years ago, running from a duke who'd bought her like property. I was younger then, less careful about interfering in human affairs. I offered her a choice. I could turn her into a vampire, make her powerful enough to face him, or I could offer her sanctuary as a human. She chose sanctuary. We fell in love slowly, carefully over years. She taught me that strength isn't always about power. Sometimes it's about choosing to stay soft in a hard world." His voice carried weight, the kind that comes from speaking truths long buried. "Our daughter, Elise, she was human. We raised her here, protected her, loved her fiercely. When she was 15, witch hunters came from the village, claiming any child raised by vampires must be corrupted. She ran. I caught her on the bridge, just as I caught you, held her while she cried, and swore she'd never be safe, that they'd always come for her. But Mira said she lived a long, happy life. She did, because I learned something important that night. Protection isn't just about keeping people inside castle walls. It's about changing the world outside so they don't need walls anymore." He closed his book, giving her his full attention. "I went to that village, spoke with their leaders, made it clear that anyone who touched my daughter would answer to me. But more than that, I opened dialogue. I invited them here. Let them see that vampires weren't monsters, that our household was filled with humans who chose to stay. Over time, fear became familiarity. Elise eventually married a boy from that village, had children, grandchildren. She died at 83, in her sleep, surrounded by family. Ilara absorbed this, trying to imagine loving someone for 50 years, knowing you'd watch them age while you stayed frozen. That must have broken your heart, watching her grow old. It did. But I'd rather have 50 years of genuine love than eternity with someone forced to stay. Casimir's expression softened. That's why I don't turn humans without their complete, enthusiastic consent, given multiple times, over many years. Immortality sounds romantic, until you realize everyone you've ever loved will die while you continue. It's not a gift, it's a burden. Is that why you live like this? Mixing humans and vampires? Creating this strange sanctuary? I live like this because isolation made me cruel. His honesty was startling. After Lenora died, I spent a century alone, bitter, convinced that caring for anyone was a weakness. I became exactly what humans feared, a monster in a castle, disconnected from the world. Then Elise came home to visit one winter, brought her children, and my grandson looked at me with Lenora's eyes and asked why I was so sad all the time. He smiled at the memory, genuine warmth breaking through centuries of careful control. Children have this way of asking questions that dismantle your defenses. I realized I'd been so busy protecting my heart that I'd forgotten how to use it. So I changed. I opened the castle, offered sanctuary to anyone who needed it, built a community instead of a fortress. It didn't bring Lenora back, but it honored what she taught me, that connection is worth the risk of loss. The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. Ilara found herself blinking back tears, not from sadness, but from recognition. Here was someone who understood that survival sometimes meant burning everything down and rebuilding from ash. My family will hate what I've become, she said quietly. If I stay here, if I build a life outside their control, they'll never forgive me. Good. Casimir's voice held steel beneath the softness. People who need your smallness to feel big don't deserve your forgiveness. Let them hate you. Let them rage and gossip and declare you ruined. You'll be too busy being yourself to care. Over the next months, Ilara discovered who herself was. She wasn't the docile daughter who smiled through dinner parties, or the perfect bride who memorized tea service etiquette. She was someone who loved astronomy, who could spend hours watching stars through spelled windows that made midnight look like a planetarium. She was someone who preferred trousers to gowns, who liked getting her hands dirty in the garden, who could debate philosophy with Thomas and laugh at Isabel's inappropriate jokes. She started teaching, helping the castle's human children learn to read and write. Many were refugees like her, brought from bad situations, and they responded to her patient instruction with eager hunger. She discovered she was good at this, at seeing potential in others, at creating safety through education and understanding. Casimir watched her transformation with quiet approval, never claiming credit, but always providing resources. Books appeared in her room on subjects she'd mentioned interest in. The music. Room's piano was suddenly tuned when she mentioned missing her childhood lessons. A telescope materialized on her balcony after she'd spent an evening staring at the stars. "You're spoiling me," she accused one evening, finding yet another stack of astronomy texts on her desk. "I'm investing in someone worth investing in." He didn't look up from his work. There's a difference. Their friendship deepened through small, careful moments. Walking the garden at dusk, while he explained which plants thrived in spelled soil. Playing chess by firelight, her strategies improving as he taught her to think 5 moves ahead. comfortable silences that stretched for hours while they read, their presence to each other becoming as natural as breathing. The castle's residents noticed. Mira smiled knowingly when Alara asked about Casimir's schedule. Lady Seraphine made comments about how her brother seemed lighter, laughed more easily. But no one pushed, because vampire culture valued patience, and everyone understood that healing couldn't be rushed. Then, 3 months after her arrival, a letter came. Mira brought it to Alara's room with hesitation written across her face. "It's from your family. We can burn it if you'd prefer." Alara's hands shook as she took the envelope. Her father's handwriting, bold and aggressive, her name spelled out like an accusation. She should burn it. She should throw it in the fire and forget her family existed. But she needed to know, needed to understand what they'd say, now that she'd been gone long enough for the scandal to settle. She opened it, read. Felt something inside her crack clean through. The letter was from her mother, though clearly dictated by her father. It explained that the family had been humiliated by her disappearance, that Lord Brennan had demanded financial compensation for the broken engagement, that her sister's marriage prospects had been damaged by her selfishness. It asked, in language sharp as knives, when she planned to stop this childish rebellion and return home to face her responsibilities. No, are you alive? No, we were worried. No, we're sorry you felt desperate enough to jump. Just anger, demands, and the bone-deep certainty that she owed them her suffering in exchange for the years they'd fed and clothed her. Alara sat on her bed, the letter trembling in her hands, and felt rage bloom in her chest like a black flower. Not sadness, not grief. Pure, clean anger at people who'd raised her like livestock, who'd watched her disappear and only mourned their damaged reputation. She found Casimir in his study, surrounded by correspondence from vampire lords across the continent. He took one look at her face and dismissed the messenger he'd been speaking with, focusing entirely on her, with that intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. They wrote. She handed him the letter, watched his expression darken as he read. "I see." His voice was dangerously quiet. "Would you like me to respond?" "No." The word came out stronger than she expected. "I want to respond, but I don't know what to say." Casimir set the letter down carefully, as if it might contaminate his desk. "What do you want to say?" Alara paced his study, energy crackling under her skin. "I want to tell them I'm not coming back, that I'd rather die than return to that house, that life, that suffocating existence where I was just a decorative object, meant to enhance their social standing. I want to tell them that I'm worth more than they ever recognized, that I'm building something here, becoming someone I actually like." Then tell them that. They won't understand. They'll just see it as more rebellion, more proof that I'm selfish and ungrateful. "Alara?" Casimir stood, moved around the desk to face her. "You can't control how they interpret your truth. You can only control whether you speak it. Write the letter you need to write, not the letter that might change their minds, because people that committed to misunderstanding you will find fault in anything." So she wrote, sat at his desk while he worked quietly beside her, offering silent support as words poured out of her like poison being drawn from a wound. She wrote about the terror of standing on that bridge, about the relief of being caught, about discovering she could be more than ornamental. She wrote about education and purpose, and the revolutionary idea that her life belonged to her, not to them. She didn't apologize, didn't soften her edges, or gentle her truth. For the first time in her life, Alara wrote exactly what she meant, and it felt like learning to fly. Casimir read it when she finished, his expression unreadable. "This is honest. It's also likely to make them furious." "Good." She meant it. I've spent my whole life making myself smaller to avoid their anger. I'm done shrinking. Then send it. He sealed the letter with his own wax, his royal seal. Let them know you're under my protection, that this isn't a phase or rebellion. This is your life now, and anyone who wants to challenge it will have to go through me. The response came 2 weeks later, not from her parents, but from her youngest sister, Margot, who'd been only 15 when Alara left. The letter was short, written in careful handwriting that suggested multiple drafts. They burned your letter in the fireplace and forbid us from speaking your name. But I needed to tell you I understand. I'm glad you're safe. I'm glad you're free. Don't come back for me. I'll find my own bridge when it's time. Alara cried when she read it, huge gasping sobs that shook her entire body. Casimir found her in the library, held her, while she grieved for a sister she couldn't save, at least not yet. His arms were strong and steady, his presence an anchor in her storm. And somewhere in that embrace, something shifted between them. She pulled back, looked up at his face, and saw her own feelings reflected there. Not pity, not merely friendship. Something deeper, more complicated, more terrifying. I can't fall in love with you, she whispered. You'll outlive me by centuries. I'll age and die, and you'll still be here. I know. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing away tears. And I can't offer you immortality as a solution, because turning you would be selfish, would be me choosing my comfort over your informed consent. So we're left with this impossible situation, where caring for you means accepting I'll lose you. That's the worst deal imaginable. It is, he smiled sadly. But I've learned that loving someone for a limited time is better than protecting yourself from ever loving at all. Lenora taught me that. If you want to love me, knowing I'll watch you grow old, I'll accept that gift with gratitude. And if you want to keep our relationship as it is, as friendship and sanctuary, I'll accept that too. Alara's mind raced. She thought about her mother, who'd married for duty and spent 40 years in quiet misery. About Lord Brennan, who'd seen her as an acquisition. About every relationship she'd witnessed that prioritized security over genuine connection. I don't know what I want, she admitted. I'm still figuring out who I am without my family defining me. But I know I feel safe with you. I know I look forward to our evenings in the library. I know that when something interesting happens, you're the first person I want to tell. Then let that be enough for now. Casimir stepped back, giving her space. Take your time. Figure out who you are. Build the life you want here. I'm not going anywhere. The seasons changed. Winter settled over the castle, snow piling high in drifts that sparkled like diamonds under spelled sunlight. Alara threw herself into teaching, expanding her small classroom to include not just children, but adults who'd never learned to read. She discovered a passion for making education accessible, for helping people unlock potential they didn't know they had. Casimir supported her work quietly, allocating funds for books and supplies, converting an unused wing of the castle into a proper school. He attended her lessons sometimes, sitting in the back like any other student, learning alongside humans and vampires alike. It was strange and beautiful, watching a 300-year-old king practice his letters beside a 6-year-old refugee. "Why do you come to my classes?" she asked one evening after everyone else had left. "You already know how to read." "I come because watching you teach reminds me why I built this sanctuary." He was helping her organize books, his movements precise and careful. You take broken people and show them they're not broken, just bent in interesting ways. It's remarkable. I learned from the best. She meant it. You did that for me. They stood in the quiet classroom, surrounded by slates with chalk drawings and primers with dog-eared pages, and Alara felt something crystallize in her chest. Not love exactly, not yet, but the foundation of it. Trust. Respect. The certainty that this person saw her clearly and liked what he saw. "I want to try," she said suddenly. "I want to try loving you, even though it's complicated and scary, and will end in loss, because I think the time we'd have would be worth the grief later." Casimir went very still, that vampire stillness that made him look carved from stone. "Are you certain?" "I won't pressure you, Alara. Your sanctuary here doesn't depend on romantic feelings. You can stay forever as my friend and resident, and nothing more." "I know. That's why I'm choosing this." She stepped closer. "You gave me freedom, then respected it. You never made my safety conditional on my affection. That's how I know this is real. Because I'm choosing you, not needing you." His smile broke across his face like dawn, transforming him from ancient king to something young and hopeful and almost human. "Then I will love you carefully. I'll love you for as long as you'll let me. And when your time comes, I'll let you go with gratitude that I got to know you at all." Their first kiss was soft, tentative, tasting of chocolate from the dessert they'd shared, and promises neither could guarantee. Alara felt her heart beat faster, felt warmth spread through her chest despite Casimir's cool skin, and thought this is what choosing feels like. Not being chosen, but actively choosing, stepping into risk with open eyes. They took it slowly, building their relationship on the foundation of friendship they'd already established. Quiet mornings watching sunrise simulations, evenings curled together reading different books, teaching classes side by side, his ancient wisdom complementing her innovative methods. They held hands walking the gardens, kissed in library corners when no one was watching, learned each other's rhythms and boundaries and dreams. The castle residents noticed the change and responded with warm approval. Mira started leaving 2 cups of tea in the library instead of 1. Lady Seraphine made knowing comments about how nice it was to see her brother happy. The children in Alara's classes drew pictures of her and the king together, crude stick figures holding hands, which she kept in a drawer like treasures. But not everyone approved. 6 months into their relationship, Lord Brennan arrived at the castle gates with a contingent of armed men, demanding his stolen bride be returned. Alara was teaching when Mira came to fetch her, worry etched across the housekeeper's kind face. "Lord Brennan is here. He's making threats. The king wants you to stay inside. Stay safe." But Alara was done hiding. She walked to the gates with her spine straight and her chin high, every inch the woman she'd become rather than the girl who'd fled. Casimir stood at the gate, arms crossed, radiating the kind of danger humans wrote folktales about. Behind him, castle guards waited with weapons drawn, a clear message about whose territory this was. Lord Brennan sat astride a huge warhorse, his face red with anger and embarrassment. He was older than Alara remembered, perhaps 50, with the cruel eyes of a man who'd never been denied what he wanted. Beside him, her father looked small and nervous, clearly dragged along against his better judgment. "There she is," Brennan sneered. "The whore who ran to vampires rather than honor her commitments." Casimir moved like lightning, one hand on his sword. "Finish that sentence and I'll paint these gates with your blood." But Alara stepped forward, placing herself between Casimir and the armed men. "No. Let him speak. Let them both speak. I want them to say out loud what they think of me, what they've always thought of me, so there's no ambiguity about why I left." Her father shifted in his saddle, unable to meet her eyes. Lord Brennan, however, had no such compunctions. You were bought and paid for, girl. Your father took my money, made promises. You owe me a wedding, heirs, the life I was promised. I owe you nothing. Ilara's voice rang clear and strong across the courtyard. My father sold something he didn't own. I'm not property. I'm not currency. I'm a person. And I chose to leave rather than spend my life as your decorative prisoner. You chose disgrace. Brennan spat the words. You've ruined your family's name, destroyed your sister's prospects, made yourself unmarriageable to any decent man. And for what? To play teacher in a monster's castle? To whore yourself to a corpse? Casimir's growl was inhuman, all predator. But Ilara held up a hand. I chose dignity over obligation. I chose education over ornamental ignorance. I chose a partner who sees me as an equal over a husband who'd see me as property. And yes, I chose a vampire who treats me with respect over a human who sees women as acquisitions. She turned to her father, who still couldn't look at her. You raised me to believe my only value was in marriage, in producing heirs, in maintaining your social standing. You never asked what I wanted, what I dreamed about, who I might become if given the chance. You just sought a daughter-shaped investment, and when I refused to pay out, you considered me a loss. Ilara, please, her father's voice cracked. You don't understand the scandal. Your mother can barely leave the house. Your sisters are suffering for your selfishness. No. The word came out hard as diamond. My sisters are suffering for your choices. You arranged my marriage to a cruel man for money. You ignored my terror, my pleas, my increasingly desperate attempts to make you understand I'd rather die than marry him. You failed us as a father, and now you're trying to make me responsible for the consequences of your failures. Silence fell over the courtyard. Even Lord Brennan seemed momentarily speechless, perhaps unused to women speaking with such clarity, such unflinching honesty. Casimir stepped beside Ilara, his presence solid and supportive. Lady Ilara is under my permanent protection. She's a valued member of my household, an educator whose work benefits this entire community. She's chosen to build her life here, and I've chosen to support that decision with every resource at my disposal. If you attempt to take her by force, you'll start a war you cannot win. If you continue to harass her with letters or visits, you'll find the vampire community far less tolerant than I am. The church won't stand for this, Brennan blustered. A human woman living in sin with a vampire king. The church already knows. Lady Seraphine appeared from the castle, elegant and terrifying in equal measure. We've been in discussion with several religious leaders who find our model of vampire-human cooperation quite progressive. They've sent observers who confirm that Lady Ilara is here by choice, that our relationship is built on mutual respect, and that accusing her of sin reflects more poorly on you than on us. Lord Brennan's face went purple. He opened his mouth, undoubtedly to say something worse, but Ilara's father finally found his voice. Enough. We're leaving. But the money, Brennan protested. Keep it. Consider it payment for wasting my daughter's time. Her father looked at Ilara finally, really looked at her, and something flickered in his expression. Regret, perhaps, or recognition that he'd lost her long before she jumped. I see you've chosen your path. I hope it brings you what you're looking for. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't acceptance, but it was acknowledgement, which was more than she'd expected. They rode away, Brennan raging, her father silent. Ilara watched them go and felt something settle in her chest. Not forgiveness, because they hadn't earned it, but closure. The final severing of ties that had been strangling her for years. Casimir's arm came around her waist, steady and warm despite the coolness of his skin. You were magnificent. I was terrified. Fear and courage aren't opposites. They're companions. He pressed a kiss to her temple. You faced them down, knowing they could hurt you, and you did it anyway. That's what bravery looks like. That night, the castle threw a celebration. Not for Lord Brennan's defeat, but for Alara's victory over the expectations that had caged her. The great hall filled with music and laughter, humans and vampires dancing together, the boundaries between species blurring in shared joy. Alara danced with Casimir, his movements graceful as water, her steps improving with practice. She danced with Thomas and Marcus and the children from her classes. She danced until her feet ached and her face hurt from smiling, until the sky outside the spelled windows showed false stars, until exhaustion pulled at her bones in the best way. Later, in the quiet of her room, their room now, they'd been sharing it for months, Casimir held her close and whispered promises into her hair. I'll love you for as long as time allows. I'll watch you age and think you're beautiful every single day. I'll hold your hand when you're 90 and remember this moment when you were young and fierce and so incredibly brave. Alara pressed her face against his chest, listening to the heart that beat so slowly she could count seconds between pulses. And I'll love you, knowing that every year I have is a gift, that you could choose eternity with someone who won't leave you, but you're choosing finite time with me instead. Always you, he murmured, for as long as we have. The years unfolded like pages in a beloved book. Alara's school grew from one classroom to an entire wing of the castle, educating hundreds of students from nearby villages. Her reputation as an educator spread, and parents who'd once feared the Vampire King began bringing their children willingly, understanding that education here came without indoctrination, just genuine learning and respect. She published papers on progressive teaching methods, collaborated with scholars from human universities who'd overcome their prejudice enough to visit. Her work appeared in journals across the continent, always attributed to Lady Alara of Silvermere Castle, a title she'd earned through merit rather than marriage. Casimir watched her flourish with pride that bordered on reverence. He attended her lectures, funded her research, built her whatever she needed to bring her visions to life. But more than that, he loved her through small moments. Morning tea prepared exactly how she liked it. Books left on her desk because he'd seen her mention interest. Notes hidden in her papers written in his precise handwriting. Your students are lucky to have you. So am I. They took trips beyond the castle, Casimir traveling under spelled cloaks that protected him from sunlight. They visited libraries in distant cities, walked through markets where humans sold goods alongside vampire merchants, attended concerts and plays, and all the experiences Alara had been denied growing up. He showed her the world, and she showed him how to see it fresh again through her eyes. 3 years after her arrival, news came from her family. Her sister Margot had run away on her wedding day, fled an arranged marriage, just as Alara had. But unlike Alara, Margot had somewhere to run to. She arrived at the castle gates in borrowed clothes, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Alara held her while she cried, while she shook, while she confessed that watching Alara choose freedom had planted seeds that finally blossomed into her own courage. I thought I could endure it, Margot whispered. I thought I could be strong enough to survive what you couldn't. But standing at that altar, looking at a man who smiled like father, I realized survival isn't enough. I want to live, really live, not just exist in a pretty cage. Then you'll stay here, Alara said firmly. You'll build whatever life you want. Learn whatever you're curious about. Become whoever you're meant to be. Margot stayed, discovered she had a gift for languages, learned 5 in 2 years, became the castle's official translator. She fell in love with Isabel, the artist, and their wedding was a celebration that brought together every species, every background, every kind of love the castle had nurtured. Ilara stood as witness, watching her sister marry for love in a ceremony that honored both of them, and felt her heart overflow. This was what sanctuary looked like. Not just escape from danger, but space to discover joy, connection, authentic self. More refugees came over the years, women fleeing marriages, men escaping religious persecution, children removed from abusive homes. The castle became known as a place of second chances, and Casimir welcomed each arrival personally, offering the same choice he'd offered Ilara. Stay as long as you need, build whatever life calls to you, be whoever you're becoming. But not everyone could be saved. Letters came occasionally from the outside world, news of women who'd stood on bridges without anyone to catch them, of children who'd suffered in silence, of people who'd needed sanctuary, but never found it. Each loss weighed on Ilara, reminded her that systemic change required more than one castle's open doors. "I want to do more," she told Casimir one evening, 5 years into their relationship. They were in their favorite spot in the library, firelight dancing across ancient texts, comfortable in the quiet that came from knowing each other so well, words became optional. More how? He set down his book, giving her his full attention as he always did. "The castle is wonderful. The school is important. But we're still just catching people after they jump. I want to change the world that pushes them to bridges in the first place." She leaned forward, animated by vision. "I want to create a network of sanctuaries across the continent. Partner with progressive vampire lords and human leaders who believe in dignity over tradition. Build schools and safe houses and legal frameworks that protect vulnerable people before crisis happens." Casimir smiled, the kind of smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You want to start a revolution?" "A quiet one, built on education and alliance rather than violence. Is that naive?" "It's ambitious, difficult, likely to face resistance from people who profit from the current system." He stood, pulled her up to face him. "It's also brilliant, and I'll help you build it in every way I can." They started small. Correspondence with other vampire rulers who'd expressed interest in the Silvermere model. Meetings with human scholars and religious leaders willing to question tradition. Legal frameworks that protected refugees and established rights for people seeking sanctuary. Ilara traveled extensively, Casimir often beside her when vampire presence would help, and sending her alone when human-to-human conversation worked better. She spoke at universities and churches and town halls, eloquent and impassioned, her story of transformation giving weight to her arguments. Slowly, painfully slowly, the world began to shift. A duchess in the eastern provinces opened her estate to refugees. A vampire lord in the southern territories created education programs modeled on Ilara's school. Religious leaders published treatises on dignity and choice that challenged centuries of doctrine. Each small victory was celebrated, each setback analyzed and learned from. By their 7th year together, when Ilara was 29 and Casimir was 307, the sanctuary network encompassed 15 locations across 4 countries. Thousands of people had found refuge, education, purpose. The culture was changing, slowly but measurably, and Ilara could point to data proving that communities with sanctuary programs saw reduced violence, increased literacy, and better mental health outcomes. "You're changing the world," Casimir told her one night, watching her work through correspondence from various sanctuary sites. "Exactly like I knew you would." "We're changing it," she corrected. "I couldn't do any of this without your support, your resources, your political connections." "You could," he said seriously. "It would be harder, slower, But you'd find a way. That's who you are. Someone who sees suffering and can't look away, who builds bridges instead of walls. Alara set down her pen, moved to where he sat, watching her with that expression he got sometimes, the one that said he was memorizing this moment against the centuries he'd spend without her. I'm going to grow old. I know. In 20 years, I'll have gray hair and wrinkles. In 40, I'll need assistance walking. In 60, if I'm lucky, I'll be ancient by human standards. And I'll think you're beautiful every single day. He pulled her into his lap, cradled her like she was precious. Alara, I've watched empires crumble and stars go dark. Nothing about you aging frightens me. The only thing that frightens me is wasting the time we have on fear. She kissed him then, deep and certain, tasting immortality and mortality mixed together, tasting all the impossible choices that had led them here. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. I want to marry you. Casimir went very still. Alara, I know it's complicated. I know there are political implications and cultural expectations and 1,000 reasons why a human marrying a vampire king might cause problems. But I want to choose you publicly, officially, the way you chose me that night on the bridge. The church won't recognize it. Your family certainly won't. We'll face criticism and scandal and judgment. When have we ever let that stop us? She pulled back to look at him directly. You taught me that other people's opinions don't get to define my choices, so I'm choosing this, if you'll have me. His smile was incandescent, transforming ancient features into something young and joyful. I've been yours since the moment I caught you falling. Marriage is just making it official. They married in the castle gardens, under the first real stars Alara had seen since arriving, Casimir having temporarily lifted the protective spells so she could experience true night sky. Lady Seraphine officiated, reading vows they'd written themselves, promises about loving across the boundaries of time and species and circumstance. Alara wore purple, her favorite color, in a dress she'd designed herself, practical enough to move in, beautiful enough to feel special. Casimir wore black embroidered with silver stars, his crown replaced with simple circlet that caught moonlight. They exchanged rings made of iron and silver mixed, symbols of their two worlds merged. Their vows were honest rather than traditional. Casimir promised to love her through aging, to never make her feel less than for being mortal, to cherish every year they had. Alara promised to live fully, to not waste time fearing death, to build a life so rich that losing it would hurt, but never feel like tragedy. I promise to be myself with you, she said, hands clasped in his. To continue growing and changing and becoming, to never make myself small to ease your grief. You're choosing to love someone mortal. I'm going to make sure that choice gives you decades of joy, not decades of watching me fade. I promise to let you age with grace, he replied, voice rough with emotion. To celebrate your gray hair and laugh lines, to find you beautiful at 90 the same way I find you beautiful now. To honor your mortality by living each moment fully, not mourning your eventual death before it comes. Their guests cheered, vampires and humans alike, celebrating a union that defied every norm and expectation. The party lasted until dawn, music and dancing and joy flowing like wine through castle halls. Margot cried happy tears. Mira fussed over details like a proud mother. Lady Seraphine made a toast about her brother, finally understanding that love was worth any cost. The years that followed were golden, the kind of happiness that comes from choice constantly renewed. Alara turned 30, then 35, then 40. Silver threads appeared in her dark hair. Fine lines gathered at the corners of her eyes. Her hands developed the first signs of arthritis from years of writing. Casimir watched each change with tenderness, his love deepening rather than fading. He massaged her hands when they ached, kissed the gray streaks in her hair, told her constantly that she was beautiful, not despite aging, but because of it, because each line and silver strand represented years they'd built together. "You're getting sentimental in your old age," she teased him on their 10th anniversary, when he spent 20 minutes describing how her laugh lines were his favorite physical feature. "I'm getting honest in my middle age," he corrected. She was 39. He was 316. "I spent too many centuries lying to myself about caring for people. I'm done wasting time on dishonesty." The Sanctuary network grew to 32 locations. Ilara's papers on progressive education became required reading at universities. She received honors from institutions that had once dismissed her as a scandal. Foreign dignitaries visited to study the Silvermere model. The vampire-human cooperation they'd pioneered became a template for peaceful coexistence across the continent. But success brought scrutiny. Conservative factions, both human and vampire, viewed their work as dangerous. Letters arrived containing threats. Protests gathered at sanctuary gates. Some vampire lords who'd initially supported them withdrew backing under pressure from traditionalists. "We're scaring people," Ilara said, reading the latest angry correspondence. "Change always does. The question is whether we back down or push forward." "What do you want to do?" Casimir trusted her judgment on human politics more than his own. "I want to invite the scared people here. Show them what we've built. Let them see that sanctuary doesn't mean chaos, that progressive values don't destroy society. They fear the unknown, so let's make it known." They hosted a summit, inviting critics and skeptics and everyone who'd spoken against their work. Ilara gave tours of the school, showed data on improved outcomes, introduced them to people whose lives had been transformed by sanctuary. She spoke honestly about challenges and failures, not pretending the system was perfect, but demonstrating it was better than what came before. Some visitors left unconvinced, too invested in traditional power structures to accept change, but others softened, seeing evidence that challenged their assumptions. A vampire lord who'd opposed them publicly apologized privately, admitted his fear of change had blinded him to possibility. A human bishop who'd preached against their work spent an afternoon talking with Margot and Isabel, then published a treatise on love transcending boundaries. Progress was slow, measured in years rather than months, but it was real. The world didn't transform overnight, but it bent gradually toward the arc of justice and dignity they'd been pulling it toward. Ilara turned 50. Her hair was more silver than dark now. Her joints protested cold mornings. She needed reading glasses for close work, but her mind was sharp, her passion undiminished, her commitment to creating a better world as fierce as ever. Casimir adored every change, every sign of years well lived. He drew her baths when her back ached, read aloud when her eyes tired, carried her upstairs on days when climbing hurt. His love hadn't diminished with her aging. It had simply evolved, becoming more tender, more conscious of each moment's preciousness. "I'm afraid sometimes," she admitted one night, lying in bed while he held her close. "Not of dying, exactly, but of leaving you alone, of you spending centuries grieving." "I'll grieve," he said honestly. "It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But I won't regret loving you. The grief is the price I pay for the privilege of knowing you, and it's worth every tear I'll shed. Promise me something. Anything. Promise you'll keep building our work after I'm gone, that the Sanctuary network won't die with me, that you'll find new partners, new educators, new people to carry the vision forward. I promise. He pressed a kiss to her silver hair. But you're not going anywhere soon. You're too stubborn to die before 90. She laughed, the sound rich with decades of shared joy. 90. That gives us 40 more years. 40 more years of watching you change the world. Sounds like a good deal to me. At 55, Ilara published her memoir, Sanctuary: Finding Freedom Beyond the Bridge. It told her story honestly, from the desperate girl in a wedding dress to the educator who'd built a network spanning continents. The book became a phenomenon, selling hundreds of thousands of copies, inspiring countless people to seek their own bridges, their own sanctuaries, their own transformations. Speaking requests flooded in. Ilara traveled when she felt strong enough, Casimir always beside her, his presence a reminder that she spoke with authority, backed by lived experience. She stood in grand halls and humble churches, told her truth, watched faces transform as people understood that change was possible. Young women approached her after speeches, thanking her for showing them alternatives to unwanted marriages. Parents asked how to build spaces where children could discover themselves. Vampires and humans alike sought advice on cooperation and coexistence. She became, quite accidentally, an icon of progressive values, a living symbol of what courage and choice could create. But fame brought complications. Conservative factions intensified opposition. Some religious leaders declared her work heretical. A few vampire lords viewed her influence over human-vampire relations as dangerous to traditional power structures. When Ilara was 60, an assassination attempt happened at a speaking engagement in a distant city. A young man, indoctrinated by extremists, lunged at her with a silver dagger meant for vampire killing. Casimir moved with supernatural speed, disarming the attacker without killing him, his restraint remarkable given the threat to his wife. The incident shook Ilara, not because she feared death, but because she realized her work had made her a target for those who profited from oppression. Casimir wanted her to stop traveling, stay safe within castle walls. But Ilara refused to let fear silence her. "They attack me because our message is working," she said, recovering in bed, while bruises faded from where she'd fallen during the chaos. "If we were ineffective, they wouldn't bother. This means we're changing things enough to threaten their power. I don't care about changing the world if it costs me you." Casimir's voice broke, rare vulnerability showing through centuries of control. "Yes, you do." She took his hand, squeezed with strength that belied her 60 years. "You care because I care, and loving me means supporting what matters to me. I'm not stopping. I'm not hiding. I'm going to keep speaking, keep building, keep fighting until my body won't let me anymore." They compromised, increased security at events, limited public appearances to venues that could be properly protected, focused more on writing and training the next generation of sanctuary leaders. Ilara's direct influence decreased slightly, but her legacy grew through students who carried her work into spaces she couldn't safely enter. At 65, Ilara received a letter from her youngest niece, her father's granddaughter, asking to visit. The family had maintained silence for decades, but the next generation had discovered Ilara's work, her books, her legacy. They wanted to understand, to learn, to bridge the gap created by their parents' rigidity. The visit was awkward, but healing. Young people who'd grown up hearing Ilara described as a scandal or cautionary tale met the reality. A dignified educator who'd built something meaningful, who'd loved deeply, who'd changed the world through courage rather than compliance. They asked questions. She answered honestly. They left with shifted perspectives, carrying seeds of change back to families still locked in traditional thinking. "Do you regret leaving them?" Casimir asked after they'd gone. Never. Ilara leaned against him, comfortable in the relationship they'd nurtured for 40 years. I regret they couldn't see me clearly enough to support my choices, but I don't regret choosing myself over their expectations. At 70, Ilara officially retired from active sanctuary work, passing leadership to a council of educators she'd trained personally. She'd built institutions strong enough to outlast her, systems that didn't depend on her charisma or personal story, but on sound principles and dedicated practitioners. She spent her remaining energy writing, documenting everything she'd learned about education, sanctuary, and social change. She wrote for future generations, for people who'd face similar choices, for anyone who needed permission to choose themselves over obligation. Casimir was with her through it all, patient and present, his love unwavering through her aging. When arthritis made writing difficult, he became her scribe, transcribing her words with meticulous care. When her memory began to fade slightly, he reminded her gently of details she'd temporarily lost. When her body weakened, he carried her through gardens she could no longer walk, describing blooms she could no longer see clearly. I thought immortal love would mean staying young together forever, she mused one evening. 80, years old, and tiny in his arms. But this is better. You're loving me through every stage, seeing beauty in each version of me. You're easy to love, he replied simply. Always have been. At 85, Ilara was bedridden more often than not, her body finally succumbing to decades of use. But her mind remained sharp, her humor intact, her love for Casimir and their work undimmed. Students visited regularly, brought her news of sanctuaries thriving across the world, told her how her legacy continued expanding. Margot, now 68 herself, sat with her daily, the sisters who'd both chosen freedom, now supporting each other through aging. "Do you remember that wedding dress burning?" Margot asked one afternoon. "Best moment of my life," Ilara said, her voice thin but certain. "Well, second best. First best was being caught." On a quiet spring evening, with Casimir holding her hand and Margot reading poetry aloud, Ilara felt her breathing slow. She wasn't afraid. Death had chased her for 85 years, and she'd outrun it long enough to build something beautiful. "I love you," she whispered to Casimir, each word requiring effort, but worth spending her last breaths on. "Thank you for catching me. Thank you for every day after. Thank you for letting me love you." His tears fell on their joined hands, the first time she'd seen him cry. "Thank you for showing me that finite time is worth more than empty eternity. Don't mourn too long," she managed. "Keep building, keep loving, keep showing people that sanctuary is possible. I promise." Ilara smiled, the expression taking all her remaining strength. She thought about the desperate girl on a bridge, about strong arms catching her, about every choice and moment that had led to this gentle ending. She'd lived fully, loved deeply, changed the world measurably. If this was death, it felt like completion rather than tragedy. Her last breath left her body as gently as a sigh. Casimir held her for hours after, memorizing the weight of her in his arms, the reality of loss settling over him like heavy snow. The funeral drew thousands, leaders from across the continent, students she'd taught, people whose lives she'd touched through sanctuary work. They came to honor not just Ilara's death, but her life, the legacy she'd built through courage and choice. Casimir gave the eulogy, his voice steady despite grief. He spoke about a woman who'd chosen herself when the world demanded her sacrifice, who'd built bridges instead of walls, who'd loved across impossible boundaries and made those boundaries seem less impossible through sheer force of will. "She taught me that strength isn't about immortality or power," he said, looking at the gathering of humans and vampires united in grief. It's about choosing love even when it comes with an expiration date. It's about building something larger than yourself. It's about being brave enough to be caught and brave enough to let go. They buried her in the castle gardens, beneath night-blooming flowers that glowed like stars. Her headstone read simply, Ilara Silvermere. She chose herself, then chose to help others do the same. Casimir mourned as he'd promised he would, deeply and honestly, allowing himself to feel the full weight of loss. But he also kept his other promise. He continued her work, expanded the sanctuary network, trained new educators, supported anyone who needed catching. Years passed, decades. The world changed, slowly but measurably. Arranged marriages became less common, educational access expanded, vampire-human cooperation normalized. Every change traced back, in part, to a woman who jumped off a bridge and been caught by someone who saw her value. Casimir never remarried. He'd had his great love, measured its worth not in years, but in depth of feeling. He wrote about Ilara constantly, ensuring her story lived beyond her, that her courage inspired generations who'd never met her but needed her example. 50 years after her death, the Sanctuary Network held its annual gathering at Silvermere Castle. Hundreds of educators, sanctuary leaders, refugees who'd found new lives, all gathering to celebrate the work Ilara had started. Casimir attended as he always did, standing among people whose lives she'd touched, feeling her presence in every conversation about dignity and choice. A young woman approached him, perhaps 25, holding a worn copy of Ilara's memoir. "Your Majesty, I wanted to thank you. I read her book 5 years ago, when I was engaged to a man I didn't love. Her story gave me courage to leave. I built my own life, became a teacher, found someone who sees me as an equal. I wouldn't have survived without knowing her example." Casimir looked at this young woman, saw echoes of Ilara in her determined eyes, and felt grief and pride mix into something bittersweet and beautiful. This was Ilara's legacy, not just the institutions she'd built, but the courage she'd inspired in countless people to choose themselves. "She'd be proud of you," he said honestly. "You honored her memory by choosing your own freedom." As the sun set over Silvermere Castle, as sanctuary leaders shared stories and planned future work, as humans and vampires collaborated on building a better world, Casimir stood by Ilara's grave and felt at peace. She'd lived 85 years, and every single one had mattered. She'd changed the world, loved deeply, died surrounded by people who valued her. And him? He'd loved someone mortal and survived the loss, was surviving it still, would carry both the grief and the gratitude forward through whatever centuries remained to him. Because Ilara had been right. Finite time well spent was worth more than empty eternity. The ache of missing her was proof that loving her had been real, had mattered, had transformed him permanently. In the garden, night-blooming flowers opened white petals toward the moon, releasing perfume that smelled like hope and new beginnings, like every person who'd ever been caught falling, like sanctuary made real through courage and choice. The sanctuary network would continue. Ilara's legacy would spread. And somewhere, somehow, Casimir believed she knew that the desperate girl on a bridge had become more than she'd ever imagined possible, had saved not just herself, but thousands of others through the radical act of choosing herself first. He touched her headstone gently, traced the carved letters of her name. "Thank you," he whispered to the night, to memory, to the love that had defined him for 85 years and would define him forever after. "Thank you for letting me catch you. Thank you for every moment after. Thank you for showing me that love is worth the grief. Always. Every time. The moon rose higher. Stars emerged. And Casimir returned to the gathering inside, ready to continue the work she'd started. To catch the next person falling. To build sanctuary for anyone brave enough to choose themselves. Because that's what love looked like. Not just holding on, but letting go when necessary. Then honoring what was built together by keeping the work alive. Ilara had jumped. He'd caught her. Together, they'd created something that would outlast them both. A legacy of hope built from one desperate moment, transformed into decades of purpose. And that, Casimir thought, was the best kind of immortality. Not living forever yourself, but creating something that would.